I am your host, Miss Marple. Let's begin our journey.
The village of Little Ambrose was precisely the sort of place where nothing happened, which was why the villagers spent so much time discussing it. On a Tuesday afternoon of exceptional clarity, the local horticultural society had gathered for its crowning jewel, the judging of the climbing roses at Briar Hall. Miss Jane Marple, visiting her old friend Mrs. Carruthers, sat on a weathered stone bench, her knitting needles moving with the rhythmic precision of a ticking clock. To the casual observer, she was merely another white-haired lady in a floral hat, blending into the background of delphiniums and lupins. In truth, Jane was occupied with her favorite pastime, the study of the terrible consistency of human nature. She watched the master of Briar Hall, Colonel Arthur Waterford, a man whose moustache was as stiff as his moral code. He was currently engaged in a polite but visibly strained conversation with his much younger wife, Evelyn. Evelyn Waterford was a beauty of the pale, ethereal sort, dressed in a silk gown of soft lavender that seemed to drift around her like smoke. Miss Marple noted the way Evelyn's eyes constantly sought the shadow of the tall yew hedge, where the village's newest resident, a brooding artist named Mark Sterling, stood sketching with aggressive strokes. The Colonel's irritation was not directed at the artist, however, but at his own sister, Muriel, who was fussing over a prize-winning Crimson Glory rosebush with a pair of silver pruning shears. "It's the sap, Arthur," cried Muriel, her voice thin and sharp. "If the sap isn't rising correctly, the bloom is half-hearted, much like people, wouldn't you say?" The Colonel grunted, his face reddening. "People should keep their sap to themselves, Muriel. It's a garden show, not a philosophy lecture." Miss Marple observed a small, peculiar thing then. Mrs. Gable, the butcher's wife, stepped toward the Colonel with a tray of lemonade, but as she approached, she caught sight of something near the base of the rose trellis. Her hand gave a violent jerk, splashing lemonade onto her own apron. She didn't cry out, she simply stared, her face draining of color until it matched her white lace collar. Miss Marple followed the woman's gaze. There, partially obscured by the thick, thorny branches of the widow's heart rose, a deep, almost black variety, lay a hand. It was a pale, delicate hand, fingers curling as if trying to grasp the very air. The silence that followed Mrs. Gable's frozen realization was shattered by the high-pitched whistle of a nearby steam engine, but it was quickly eclipsed by a human sound, a low, rhythmic thudding from the other side of the trellis. Colonel Waterford reached the roses first. He pushed aside the heavy, flower-laden vines with a strength that belied his age, and then he stopped. He stood perfectly still, his back to the crowd, his shoulders suddenly sagging as if the weight of the manor itself had settled upon them. Is it a person?" Muriel whispered, her pruning shears clicking shut with a final, metallic snap. "It's Gregory," the Colonel said, his voice strangely hollow. Gregory Vance was the estate's lawyer, a man who knew the financial secrets of every person in Little Ambrose. He was lying in the damp earth of the rose garden, his sightless eyes staring up through the canopy of thorns. There was no obvious sign of a struggle, no blood staining his crisp linen suit. He looked almost as if he had fallen asleep, save for the peculiar, vivid blue tint of his fingernails, and the faint, sweet scent of bitter almonds that struggled to compete with the heavy perfume of the roses. Miss Marple remained on her bench, her eyes narrowing as she watched the inner circle's reactions. Evelyn Waterford had fainted, a graceful collapse into the lavender silk. Muriel was staring at her pruning shears with a look of bewildered horror. Mark Sterling had stopped sketching, his charcoal pencil held poised over the paper like a weapon. But it was the Colonel who intrigued Miss Marple the most. He wasn't looking at the body, he was looking at his wife's discarded garden gloves, which lay just inches away from the lawyer's outstretched hand. The tranquility of Little Ambrose had not just been disrupted, It had been surgically dismantled in the middle of a prize-winning garden. By the time the sun had begun to set behind the jagged limestone ridges that sheltered Little Ambrose, the village had transformed into a frantic hive of whispered conjecture and performative grief. The Horticultural Society's judging had been abandoned, leaving the prize-winning roses to wilt in the evening chill, their petals curling like scorched paper. Inside the drawing-room of Briar Hall, the atmosphere was stifling, thick with the scent of floor wax and the low, urgent thrum of communal anxiety. Miss Marple sat in a corner chair upholstered in faded pettipoints, her knitting needles clicking with a steady, metronomic rhythm that served as a quiet anchor amidst the swirling chaos. She observed the room with the detached interest of a biologist watching a specimen under glass, noting how quickly the veneer of neighborly concern was being stripped away to reveal the raw nerves beneath. The villagers' theories were as varied as they were flawed. Mrs. Gable, having recovered from her initial shock with the help of a stiff brandy, was convinced that Gregory Vance had been the victim of a mysterious, wandering tramp she claimed to have seen lurking near the potting shed. It was a classic local reflex. Miss Marple recalled how, in St. Mary Mead, every unexplained occurrence from a missing chicken to a broken window was immediately attributed to a mythical stranger, to avoid looking too closely at one's own cousins. Mrs. Gable's theory was convenient because it required no introspection and no loss of social standing for the inhabitants of Briar Hall. However, the butcher's wife failed to explain why a wandering tramp would carry a rare, fast-acting poison that smelled of bitter almonds, or why he would choose to leave a prosperous lawyer in the middle of a rose garden rather than making off with the Colonel's silver. Muriel Waterford, meanwhile, paced the length of the Persian rug, her fingers obsessively tracing the sharp edge of her pruning shears. She insisted that poor Gregory must have had a sudden catastrophic heart attack brought on by the unseasonable heat. "He was a man of high pressure, Jane," she said, pausing briefly before Miss Marple's chair, "always dealing with those dreadful legal tangles and the Colonel's increasingly difficult estate matters. It's a tragedy, of course, but nature is often quite abrupt with those who do not take care of their constitutions." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, though she noted that Muriel was speaking of constitutions with a peculiar defensive intensity. It was the same tone used by the old postmaster back home when he tried to convince the village that his missing ledger had simply dissolved in a damp cellar. At the far end of the room, Mark Sterling, the artist, remained a silent and brooding presence. He leaned against the heavy oak mantel, his charcoal-stained fingers tapping a restless rhythm against the wood. The village gossip, led by the vicar's wife, was already beginning to coalesce around him. He was the outsider, the man with the dark, expressive eyes who had been seen painting Evelyn Waterford with a frequency that suggested more than mere professional interest. To the villagers, an artist was a naturally suspicious creature, prone to fits of passion and lacking the steady, predictable morality of a retired officer or a tradesman. The theory circulating near the tea service was that Vance had discovered a scandalous secret between Sterling and the Colonel's wife and had been silenced to protect a budding romance. Miss Marple listened to the cacophony of voices, each person projecting their own fears and prejudices onto the dead man. She saw the way Evelyn Waterford sat in the shadows, her lavender silk gown looking grey in the twilight, and how she avoided her husband's gaze with a terrifying consistency. She noticed the Colonel's rigid silence, a silence that felt less like mourning and more like a tactical retreat. They were all building walls of words to hide the one truth that Miss Marple found most striking, the scent of bitter almonds. In her experience, such a specific and deadly detail was never the result of a tramp's whim or a heart's failure. It was the mark of a calculated choice, a domestic solution to a legal problem. As the local doctor and the constable finally arrived to begin their official business, Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and felt a familiar, cold certainty. The village was looking at the roses, but she was looking at the thorns, and she knew that the most beautiful flowers often grew in the most poisoned soil. Inspector Slack arrived at Briar Hall with the heavy-treaded confidence of a man who believed that crime was a simple matter of looking for the largest footprint. He brought with him a flurry of notebooks and a sergeant who seemed to spend most of his time tripping over the meticulously kept flower beds. While the inspector spent the morning examining the physical boundaries of the rose garden and demanding to know if any of the garden gates had been left unlocked, Miss Marple remained on the terrace. She had relocated her knitting to a spot near the open French windows of the library, a position that allowed her to observe both the official movements in the garden and the private tensions within the house. To the casual eye, she was merely an elderly guest seeking the morning sun, but her mind was busy comparing the scene to the famous case of the poisoned preserves in St. Mary Mead, where the culprit was caught not by a fingerprint, but by the way she had arranged her pantry shelves. The official investigation was focused entirely on the how of the entry. Slack was convinced that an intruder had scaled the orchard wall and hidden among the tall delphiniums until the lawyer was alone. He ignored the fact that the dew on the grass near the wall had been entirely undisturbed at dawn, and that the Colonel's high-strung terrier, which barked at even a passing butterfly, had remained silent throughout the previous afternoon. Miss Marple watched through her spectacles as the inspector pointed dramatically at a scuff mark on the gravel, which she knew perfectly well had been made by the butcher's boy making his delivery 2 days prior. It was a classic example of looking for the spectacular when the mundane was far more revealing. "It's a clear case of a grudge, Sergeant." Slack's voice drifted through the library windows, echoing with self-assurance. Vance was a lawyer. He probably had hundreds of enemies. Some disgruntled client tracked him here, waited for the judges to be distracted, and struck. "We'll find a trace of the container soon enough. Someone must have seen a stranger on the road from the station." Miss Marple sighed softly, her needles clicking a quiet, rhythmic descent. While the inspector looked for strangers, she was looking at the household. She noticed that the lemonade tray, which had been abandoned on the grass during the initial panic, still held 3 glasses that had been partially drained. One of those glasses sat apart from the others, tucked slightly behind a pot of geraniums. More importantly, she observed the behavior of the parlour-maid, Alice, who was currently polishing the brass handles of the library doors. The girl was working with a frantic, trembling energy, her eyes constantly darting toward Muriel Waterford's gardening basket. When Muriel approached the terrace, Alice dropped her polishing cloth and hurried away as if she had been caught in a criminal act. "It is so very difficult to get the brass truly bright in this damp weather, isn't it?" Miss Marple remarked as Muriel stepped onto the stone tiles. The Colonel's sister looked haggard, her usual sharp efficiency replaced by a brittle, defensive posture. "Everything is difficult today, Jane," Muriel replied, her voice tight. "The police are trampling over the roses, and the Colonel is locked in his study. It's also very untidy. Gregory was a friend, but he was also a man who insisted on perfection. He was going to review the estate accounts this morning, you know. He thought there had been some irregularities." Miss Marple noted the word irregularities with the same care she would use to mark a dropped stitch. "Accountancy is such a dry subject, dear. Like old Mr. Tilling's ledger back home. Everyone thought he was a saint until they realized he had been using the church funds to pay for his sister's extravagant hats. It's the little things that people try to hide that usually cause the most trouble. I couldn't help but notice that your pruning shears are particularly clean this morning. You must have spent a great deal of time scrubbing them after the judging." Muriel's hand flew to the pocket of her gardening apron, her knuckles whitening. "One must keep one's tools in order, Jane. Sap is very corrosive to silver." She turned abruptly and walked toward the house, her gait stiff and hurried. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind piecing together a pattern that had nothing to do with intruders scaling walls. She thought of the vivid blue fingernails of the deceased and the peculiar clinical cleanliness of Muriel's shears. In Little Ambrose, as in St. Mary Mead, The most revealing patterns were often found in the habits of those who were most anxious to maintain appearances. The inspector was looking for a villain in a cloth cap, but Miss Marple was looking at the silver in the garden basket, and she knew that the bitter scent of almonds did not come from a stranger's hand. By the following afternoon, Inspector Slack had found the convenient villain his narrative required, and the village of Little Ambrose was more than happy to provide the necessary stage for his triumph. The obvious suspect was Mark Sterling, the artist whose presence at Briar Hall had been a source of simmering resentment since his arrival. Slack had discovered a small glass vial hidden in the pocket of Sterling's velvet painting jacket, which was currently draped over a chair in the gardener's cottage he used as a studio. The vial was empty, but a cursory sniff from the local apothecary confirmed the lingering, sickly sweet scent of cyanide. To the inspector, this was the definitive end of the puzzle. He concluded that Sterling, driven by a bohemian passion for Evelyn Waterford, had poisoned the lawyer to prevent Vance from revealing a clandestine affair to the Colonel. It was a story that combined sex, art, and betrayal, a trifecta that satisfied the village's appetite for scandal while exonerating the respectable members of the manor. Miss Marple sat in the small glass-fronted conservatory, her knitting needles silent, as she watched the inspector lead a protesting Sterling toward the waiting police car. The artist's face was flushed with a mixture of rage and bewilderment, his charcoal-stained hands gesturing wildly as he tried to explain that the vial had been used for a specific chemical wash for his canvases, a common enough practice among painters of his school. Slack, of course, was no man for the nuances of artistic technique. He saw a dead lawyer, a poisoned vial, and a man with a motive as old as time. He ignored the fact that Sterling had been standing in full view of 3 witnesses near the yew hedge at the very moment Gregory Vance was estimated to have collapsed. "It is very satisfying for the inspector, is it not?" Miss Marple remarked to Mrs. Carruthers, who was busy arranging a bowl of late-season fruit. "To find a criminal who looks exactly like a criminal. It reminds me so much of young Arthur Badgley back home, who was once accused of stealing the choir's biscuit fund simply because he had a squint and a penchant for wearing his cap backward. Everyone was quite convinced of his guilt, until it was discovered that the vicar had accidentally locked the tin in the safe and forgotten the combination. People are so very quick to believe the worst of those who don't quite fit in." Mrs. Carruthers paused, a pear in each hand. "But Jane, the vial!" And everyone saw how he looked at Evelyn. "It's almost a relief in a way. It would have been too dreadful if it was someone we actually knew at the tennis club." "Oh, indeed, dear. Very dreadful," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes twinkling with a sharpness she quickly masked. "But I find myself wondering about the gloves. If Mr. Sterling was so careful to use a vial of poison, why was he so careless to leave it in his pocket for the police to find? And why, for that matter, were Evelyn's garden gloves found so near the body, yet her hands were perfectly clean when she fainted? It's the arrangement of the details that is so very peculiar. It's like a painting that has been touched up by a clumsy hand. The colours are right, but the brushstrokes are all wrong." The village was eager to close the chapter on Gregory Vance. They wanted to return to their tea parties and their rows, judging without the shadow of a local murderer hanging over them. But Miss Marple noticed that while Sterling was being driven away, the tension in Briar Hall did not dissipate. Lady Evelyn remained locked in her boudoir, and Muriel Waterford was seen in the kitchen garden, frantically pulling up weeds that weren't there. More tellingly, the Colonel had not emerged from his study to witness the arrest of the man who had supposedly coveted his wife. He was a man who prided himself on his military decisiveness, yet he was hiding from a victory. Miss Marple knew the inspector's hit was hollow. The first suspect was a screen, a convenient vessel for the village's prejudices. She thought of the silver pruning shears and the third lemonade glass that had been hidden behind the geraniums. Cyanide was a quick death, but it required a delivery system, a drink, a touch, or a breath. Sterling might have the passion, but he lacked the intimate access to the household's daily rhythms. He was a man who lived on the periphery, whereas the murder had been committed at the very heart of the garden. As she watched the police car disappear down the lane, Miss Marple felt a profound sense of melancholy. The obvious answer was rarely the true one, and she knew that the real killer was currently breathing a sigh of relief, believing that a bohemian artist's jacket had successfully hidden a family's rot. The morning after Mark Sterling's arrest, the manor house fell into a state of unnatural leaden silence. Inspector Slack had departed for the county seat to finalize his report, leaving only a lone constable to guard the entrance to the rose garden. While the village of Little Ambrose celebrated the swift resolution of the tragedy, Miss Marple remained unconvinced. She spent the early hours of the day in the library, ostensibly writing letters to her nephew Raymond, but her true focus was on the small mundane objects that populated the room. It was then that she noticed a minor detail that everyone else had overlooked: a small, rectangular patch of dust on the mahogany sideboard where a silver trophy had once stood. Miss Marple recalled the trophy from her visit the previous summer. It was a heavy, ornate cup for excellence in rose cultivation, won by the Colonel's father. Its absence was not necessarily suspicious, but the fact that the dust beneath it was remarkably fresh suggested it had been moved very recently. She wandered toward the terrace, where the parlour maid Alice was nervously beating a rug. Miss Marple paused, adjusting her spectacles. "It is such a shame about the silver cup, Alice," she said gently. "I noticed it was missing from the sideboard. I suppose it was sent away for polishing after the excitement of the garden show?" Alice's face turned a startling shade of crimson, and she gripped the rug beater with a fervour that bordered on the desperate. I don't know, miss. Miss Muriel told me to put it in the back of the pantry. She said it was tarnished and didn't look right with all the visitors coming." Tarnished. How very peculiar, Miss Marple murmured, her mind already drawing a parallel to the case of the apothecary's daughter who had hidden a stained apron in the flour bin. One would think a trophy would be the first thing a family would want to show off during a festival. It reminds me so much of poor Mr. Benchley back home, who tried to hide his cracked teapot by putting a large vase of chrysanthemums in front of it. He didn't realize that the vase was even more conspicuous than the crack. She left the girl to her rug beating and moved toward the pantry under the guise of asking for a glass of water. There, tucked behind a stack of oversized serving platters, she found the silver trophy. It was not tarnished at all, in fact. It had been polished to a mirror-like shine. However, as Miss Marple tilted the cup toward the light, she noticed a tiny crystalline residue caught in the intricate engraving of the base. It was a fine white powder, nearly invisible to the naked eye. She touched a finger and brought it to her nose. There was no scent, but when she looked at the interior of the cup, she saw a faint, dark ring at the bottom, as if a liquid had been left to evaporate. This was the detail that changed everything. Gregory Vance had been found in the rose garden, but the lemonade glasses on the tray were not the only vessels in the house. The Colonel was known for his tradition of sharing a celebratory drink from the trophy cup with his lawyer after every successful horticultural event. If the poison had been administered via the trophy, then the entire timeline of the murder shifted. It meant that Vance had been poisoned inside the house, in the privacy of the library or the study, and had only then walked out into the garden before the cyanide took its swift, lethal effect. The artist, Sterling, had been in the garden all afternoon. He had no access to the silver trophy in the library. Miss Marple realized that the broken window, the misplaced gloves, and the vial in the artist's pocket were all pieces of a theatrical production designed to lead the eye away from the house and toward the bohemian outsider. The killer had relied on the inspector's predictability, knowing Slack would favor a dramatic external motive over a domestic one. But the silver trophy told a different story, a story of a ritualized death, committed by someone who knew the Colonel's habits and had the authority to move the silver without question. As she replaced the cup behind the platters, Miss Marple felt a profound sense of clarity. The irregularities Muriel had mentioned were not just in the estate accounts, they were in the very heart of the family's traditions. The poison had been served in a vessel of pride, and the culprit was someone who had been polishing the lie until it gleamed. The following afternoon, the air in Little Ambrose felt heavy with a peculiar electric tension, as if the village were a piece of silk being stretched to the point of tearing. While the official narrative regarding the artist's guilt remained undisturbed at the police station, the local social fabric was beginning to reveal its hidden, frayed edges. Miss Marple, sensing that the true history of Briar Hall was not to be found in the garden, but in the long-buried resentments of its inhabitants, decided to visit the village records office and the local post office. It was a well-known fact that in a small town, the past never truly dies. It merely undergoes a process of quiet, malignant fermentation until someone happens to stir the barrel. The first revelation came from Mrs. Gable, whose butcher's shop served as a confessional for the village's domestic secrets. Under the guise of inquiring about a specific cut of lamb, Miss Marple learned that the Waterford family's financial standing was far more precarious than their grand manner suggested. It appeared that Gregory Vance had not just been the family's lawyer, but its primary creditor. Sir Arthur's father had been a man of expensive tastes and poor judgment, and over the decades, the Vance family had systematically acquired the mortgages on nearly every acre of Briar Hall's tenant farms. To the village, the colonel was a landlord of immense power, but to the lawyer, he was merely a tenant in his own ancestral home. Gregory was a hard man when it came to a shilling, Mrs. Gable whispered, her eyes darting toward the street. He was planning to call in the debts this Michaelmas. He told my husband that the colonel had a choice: sell the estate to a London development firm or find a way to pay the interest that had been compounding for 20 years. It wasn't just business, Jane. There was a nastiness to it. Gregory's father had once been Waterford's stable manager. He never forgot the way the old colonel had dismissed him, and it seems the son was quite determined to settle the score by taking the house itself. This history of social inversion provided a motive far more potent than the artist's supposed passion. Miss Marple reflected on the nature of pride. It was the most dangerous of all the human failings, especially when it was tied to the land. She then directed her inquiries toward Muriel Waterford, through a series of delicate conversations with the elderly librarian, who had a memory like a filing cabinet. She discovered that Muriel had once been engaged to Gregory Vance in their youth. The engagement had been broken off abruptly when Gregory discovered that Muriel's dowry had been squandered by her brother to cover his first military commissions. Muriel had remained a spinster, devoted to the house and her roses, while Gregory had remained a bachelor, devoted to his ledgers and his slow, methodical revenge. "It's a tangled thicket, isn't it?" Miss Marple remarked to herself as she walked back toward Briar Hall. "Like the old ivy that eventually pulls down the chimney. Everyone thinks it's holding the house together, but it's actually feeding on the mortar." She recalled the way Muriel had looked at her pruning shears and the way the colonel had retreated into his study. They were people whose entire identity was built on a foundation of Waterford of Briar Hall. To lose the house was to cease to exist in the eyes of the county. Gregory Vance was not just a lawyer, he was a living reminder of their decline and a threat to their survival. As the sun began to cast long skeletal shadows across the driveway, Miss Marple observed a quiet confrontation between Evelyn Waterford and Muriel near the fountain. It was not a conversation between friends, but a transaction between captives. Evelyn looked terrified, her hands fluttering at her throat, while Muriel spoke with a low, controlled ferocity. The artist, Sterling, had been the perfect scapegoat, an outsider who could be sacrificed to protect the inner sanctum. Miss Marple realized that the irregularities in the accounts were not just financial, they were moral. The family had conspired to protect a legacy that was already dead, and Gregory Vance had been the sacrificial lamb on the altar of their pride. The motive was not love, but the desperate collective need to stop the clock. As she watched the two women part, Miss Marple felt the weight of the secrets that had turned a peaceful rose garden into a site of cold-blooded execution. The how of the murder was becoming clear, and it was rooted in a past that none of them could afford to acknowledge. The following morning, a new and unsettling revelation rippled through Little Ambrose, seemingly providing the final ironclad proof of Mark Sterling's villainy, while simultaneously shifting the focus of the investigation. A young boy, fishing for minnows in the narrow stream that bordered the Waterford estate, pulled a sodden leather satchel from the reeds. When the local constable pried it open, he found it stuffed with Gregory Vance's missing private ledgers and a small ivory-handled pistol. This discovery sent Inspector Slack into a fresh paroxysm of professional triumph. He concluded that Sterling had not only poisoned the lawyer, but had also intended to stage an armed robbery, panicking at the last moment and discarding the evidence in the water. The presence of the ledgers, which contained the most sensitive financial secrets of the village, suggested a much darker motive of professional blackmail. Miss Marple, however, viewed this sudden windfall of physical evidence with a deep, weary skepticism. She sat in the morning room, her knitting needles moving with a rhythmic, thoughtful clicking as she watched the inspector march across the lawn to examine the muddy satchel. For Jane, discovery was too convenient. In her long experience of human nature, she had noticed that when a criminal is truly desperate, they do not leave a neatly packed bag of incriminating evidence in a place where a schoolboy might find it. They burn paper and melt lead. This was not the act of a panicking artist, it was the act of a director providing a new set of props for a flagging play. The twist was designed to reinforce the idea that the crime was external, a sordid matter of theft and extortion, rather than a domestic tragedy rooted in the very house itself. "It is such a remarkable coincidence, is it not?" Miss Marple remarked to the vicar's wife, who had dropped by to discuss the arrangements for the lawyer's funeral, to find exactly what was missing in the very place where the current takes everything to the weir. "It reminds me so much of the time old Mr. Gillingham lost his spectacles and found them placed neatly on his own doorstep the next morning. Everyone thought it was a miracle, but of course it was simply his grandson playing a trick to avoid being scolded for his own carelessness. When the evidence is handed to us on a silver platter, one must always wonder who polished the silver." The vicar's wife looked uncomfortable, her eyes darting toward the Colonel's study. "But the ledgers, Jane. If they contain proof of blackmail, it explains everything. Sterling must have been much more dangerous than we realized. Slack says the pistol was recently cleaned, though the water has ruined it now. It's a relief to know the motive was so criminal." Miss Marple nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She had noticed something about the satchel that the inspector had missed in his haste. The leather was indeed soaked, but the interior of the bag remained surprisingly dry, protected by a lining of heavy oiled silk. More importantly, the ink on the ledgers, while slightly smudged, was still perfectly legible. This meant the bag had not been in the stream for days, but had been placed there only hours before the boy found it. It was a fresh deception, a second layer of paint applied to the original lie. The other twist was not a revelation of Sterling's guilt, but a reinforcement of the killer's desperation. They were running out of ways to distract the law, and they were resorting to the most traditional of red herrings. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple observed Muriel Waterford supervising the cleaning of the library. The silver trophy had been returned to its place on the sideboard, gleaming and innocent. The house was being scrubbed of its secrets. The ledgers were in police custody, and the artist was in a cell. Yet the air of unease in Briar Hall remained. Miss Marple realized that the discovery of the satchel served one purpose above all others. It shifted the focus away from the bitter almond scent and toward a conventional robbery. By introducing a gun and a theft, the killer was attempting to override the clinical domestic reality of the poison. It was a psychological masterstroke aimed at a man of Slack's limited imagination. But as she watched Muriel carefully arrange a fresh vase of roses, Miss Marple felt the cold weight of the truth. The ledgers hadn't been stolen by an artist. They had been found by a family that could finally afford to let them be seen, provided they were seen in the wrong hands. The deception was complete, but for one small, rhythmic clicking of knitting needles that refused to accept the obvious. The following afternoon, the drawing room of Briar Hall was bathed in a deceptive golden light that seemed to mock the grim reality of the ongoing police investigation. Miss Marple, realizing that the official inquiry had reached a state of comfortable stagnation, decided the time had come for a more surgical intervention. She found Muriel Waterford alone in the morning room, methodically cataloguing a collection of antique lace. The woman's movements were precise, almost mechanical, her face a mask of iron-willed composure that would have intimidated a less observant visitor. Miss Marple settled into the chair opposite her, her knitting bag perched on her lap like a silent witness, her needles beginning their soft conversational clicking. "It is such a comfort to see you occupied with something so delicate, Muriel," Miss Marple began, her voice fluttering with a simulated elderly fragility. "In times of such great distress, the small domestic tasks are the only things that keep one's mind from wandering into the darker corners of the imagination. I was just thinking about your lace, so intricate, so easily torn, yet surprisingly resilient if the threads are woven correctly. It reminds me so much of a case back in St. Mary Mead involving the old postmaster's daughter. She was quite the expert at mending things, you see. She could hide a hole so perfectly that no one even knew the garment had been damaged." Muriel did not look up, her needle pulling a thread through the lace with a sharp, rhythmic snap. "Mending is a necessary skill, Jane, especially when one is left to maintain a household that others are quite content to see fall into disrepair. My brother has the military mind for the grand gestures, but it is I who have always attended to the details. Details are what prevent a structure from collapsing." "Quite right, dear, quite right," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes twinkling with a sharpness she quickly masked behind a blink. "But details can be such treacherous things, right? Like the detail of the silver trophy cup. I was just admiring how beautifully it has been polished. It is a credit to your diligence. I was reminded of it because I happened to find a small, peculiar bottle in the potting shed this morning, one that smelled quite strongly of cleaning fluid. Yet when I looked at the label, it wasn't a cleaning fluid at all. It was a horticultural preparation for the roses, specifically the widow's heart variety that Gregory Vance was so fond of. It's a very specialized chemical, I believe, one that requires the use of gloves and a very steady hand." Muriel's needle paused mid-air. For the first time she looked directly at Miss Marple, her eyes cold and guarded. "I don't see what a bottle in a potting shed has to do with the current tragedy, Jane. The inspector has already found the vial in the artist's pocket. The matter is settled." "Is it, dear? I wonder," Miss Marple murmured, leaning forward just an inch. "You see, the bottle I found was nearly empty, but the residue matched the fine white powder I noticed in the engraving of the trophy cup. It struck me as such a curious coincidence. Why would rose pesticide be inside a celebratory cup? Unless, of course, the cup was used to deliver something else entirely. Something that smelled of bitter almonds. It made me think of poor Mr. Benchley's dog. It died quite suddenly after licking a bowl that had been used to mix a similar preparation. Mr. Benchley was heartbroken, but his sister was quite relieved, as the dog had been a constant drain on her limited resources. She was a woman who valued the honor of her home above all else. The silence in the room became absolute, the only sound the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Muriel's face remained a mask, but the lace in her hands was being gripped with a force that threatened to rend the delicate fabric. Miss Marple watched the woman's knuckles, noting how they turned the color of bone. "It must be a very heavy burden, Muriel," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, "to be the only one who truly understands the cost of keeping Briar Hall in the family. To know that the man you once loved was the very man who was going to take it all away. I imagine a woman in that position might feel that a single sharp act of pruning was the only way to save the rest of the garden." Muriel slowly set the lace on the table. Her expression did not break, but her eyes held a sudden naked flash of recognition, not of guilt, but of being seen. She didn't deny the accusation, nor did she bluster as the inspector might have expected. Instead, she stood up with a chilling, regal dignity. "You have always had a very vivid imagination, Jane. It is a pity you didn't apply it to something more productive than village gossip." As she walked toward the door, her gait was as rigid and uncompromising as the Colonel's, leaving Miss Marple with the definitive proof she sought. It wasn't a confession in words, but a reaction of profound, calculated stillness. The test had revealed the steel beneath the spinster's shawl, and the secret of the silver trophy was no longer a mystery. The following morning, Briar Hall's living room was arranged with a precision that felt more like a military briefing than a social gathering. Inspector Slack was present, looking immensely pleased with himself as he tapped his briefcase, which now contained the formal warrant for Mark Sterling's transfer to the county jail. Colonel Waterford stood by the cold hearth, his shoulders hunched, while Evelyn sat in the shadows of the velvet curtains, her face a pale, translucent mask of grief. Muriel Waterford occupied her usual chair, her hands busy with a piece of embroidery, her needles moving with a steady, unflinching rhythm. Miss Marple sat in the center of the room, her knitting bag at her feet, looking like a harmless spectator to a tragedy she had already deciphered in its entirety. "I must apologize for the interruption, Inspector," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but possessing a surprising clarity that cut through the low hum of the room. "But I fear that the narrative you have constructed is like a poorly knitted garment. It looks quite well from a distance, but if one pulls on a single loose thread, the entire thing begins to unravel. We have been looking for an intruder with a vial of poison, or a bohemian artist driven by passion, but a man of Mark Sterling's temperament does not use cyanide, nor does he hide ledgers in a stream while leaving a gun to be found. This was a crime of preservation, committed by someone who understood that the only way to save the Waterford name was to remove the man who held its mortgage." Inspector Slack gave a short, disparaging laugh. "The evidence is in the satchel, Miss Marple. The artist had motive and means. We found the empty vial in his jacket. It's a closed book. It is a book with a very clumsy ending, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, her blue eyes fixing on Muriel's moving needles. "The vial was placed in Mr. Sterling's pocket after the murder, just as the satchel was placed in the stream only yesterday. The killer relied on your predictable dislike of outsiders to ensure that the investigation stayed outside the manor walls. But the murder did not happen in the garden. Gregory Vance did not die because he was accosted by a stranger among the roses. He died because he followed a long-standing tradition of this house, the sharing of a celebratory drink from the silver trophy cup. He was poisoned in the library, in the privacy of his own client's home, and he walked into the garden, already a dying man." The Colonel looked up, his face ashen. "The trophy? That's impossible. It was on the sideboard the whole time. It was on the sideboard, Colonel, until it was moved to the pantry to be scrubbed of the evidence," Miss Marple continued. "I found the residue of the poison in the engraving of that cup. It wasn't a rare chemical from an artist's studio. It was a horticultural pesticide used for the widow's heart roses, a preparation that Muriel knows better than anyone in the village. She didn't kill Gregory because of an affair or a robbery. She killed him because she discovered that he was going to dismantle Briar Hall and sell the land to developers. She killed him because 40 years ago he had rejected her, and now he was returning to take the only thing she had left, the honor and the roof of her family. Muriel's embroidery needle stopped mid-stitch, but she did not look up. The silence in the room was absolute. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the inspector. You wondered why Evelyn's gloves were found near the body, yet her hands were clean. They were placed there by Muriel to ensure that if the artist wasn't blamed, the blame would fall on the frail wife. It was a secondary line of defense. Muriel even used her own silver pruning shears to tidy the garden after the collapse, ensuring that no signs of a struggle existed because there never was a struggle. Gregory simply drank, walked into the sun, and fell among the roses he had once hoped to own. "This is madness," Slack stammered, though his eyes were darting toward Muriel. "You have no proof. I have the third lemonade glass, Inspector, the one hidden behind the geraniums that Muriel used to wash down the bitter taste of the almonds she herself had handled," Miss Marple said with a profound, quiet sadness. "And I have the timing of the silver trophy's cleaning. But most of all, I have the character of a woman who has spent her life sacrificing everything for a house that was already rotting. Muriel didn't see it as a murder. She saw it as an act of horticultural necessity, the pruning of a parasite." Muriel Waterford slowly laid her embroidery on the table. She didn't shout or offer a frantic denial. She simply looked at her brother, her expression one of cold, sacrificial triumph. "I did what you were too weak to do, Arthur," she said, her voice like the snapping of a dry twig. "I saved the house. It doesn't matter what happens to me now. Briar Hall belongs to the Waterfords again." As the inspector moved forward to perform the duty he had so nearly botched, the mystery of the rose garden reached its bitter conclusion, revealing that the most lethal thorns are often those grown out of a distorted sense of duty. The morning after Muriel Waterford's departure in the custody of the county police, Little Ambrose seemed to have wrapped itself in a thick, insulating blanket of white mist, as if the village were trying to erase the memory of the past week. The gates of Briar Hall remained closed, and the widow's heart roses, once the pride of the county, appeared strangely muted in the grey light, their deep crimson petals heavy with dew. Miss Marple stood on the platform of the small railway station, her sensible tweed coat buttoned against the morning chill, and her knitting bag tucked securely under her arm. She was waiting for the 9:15 train to St. Mary Mead, her mind already shifting away from the tragedy of the rose garden and toward the more pressing matter of her own neglected vegetable patch. The vicar, a man whose habitual air of gentle distraction had been replaced by a look of profound, troubled contemplation, joined her on the platform. He stood beside her in silence for a moment, watching the steam rise from a distant locomotive. "It is a heavy thing to carry, Jane," he said at last, his voice barely a whisper. "To think that Muriel, a woman I have known for 30 years, could harbour such a cold, calculated intent. It makes one feel as though the very ground we walk upon is merely a thin crust over an abyss. We see the garden and the flowers, but we forget the roots that grow in the dark." Miss Marple adjusted her gloves, her expression one of soft, melancholy wisdom. "It is the nature of people to build walls, Vicar, and sometimes the most respectable walls are the ones that hide the most desperate secrets." Muriel didn't see herself as a criminal. In her mind, she was a soldier defending a fortress. She had lived in that house for so long that she had ceased to exist as an individual. When Gregory Vance threatened the estate, he wasn't just threatening a piece of property, he was threatening her entire reality. It's a very common human failing, though rarely taken to such a lethal extreme. It reminds me so much of old Mrs. Prentice back home, who once burned down her neighbour's hedge because it was casting a shadow on her prize-winning geraniums. She felt entirely justified because, to her, the geraniums were the only things that mattered in the world. The vicar sighed, shaking his head. "And the Colonel? He seems like a broken man. He has his house back, but at what a price? I fear the silence in Briar Hall will be louder than any scandal." "The Colonel is a man who preferred not to know," Miss Marple replied, her gaze drifting toward the distant chimneys of the manor. "And that is a form of complicity in itself." He allowed his sister to carry the burden of the family's decline until she became warped by the weight of it. "We are all responsible for the gardens we tend, Vicar. If we ignore the weeds for too long, we shouldn't be surprised when they eventually choke the life out of the blooms. It is a sad business, truly. Mark Sterling will be released, of course, and Evelyn may find some measure of peace, but the house itself will always carry the scent of those bitter almonds. It is a reminder that pride is a very poisonous vintage when it is left to ferment in a closed room." As the train pulled into the station with a rhythmic metallic clatter, Miss Marple felt a sense of quiet relief. The puzzles of little Ambrose were solved, the irregularities of the heart had been laid bare, and justice, however untidy, had been served. She accepted the porter's hand as she stepped onto the carriage, taking her seat by the window. As the train began to move, she watched the village recede, the church spire, the butcher's shop, and the tall yew hedges of Briar Hall, until they were nothing more than a memory in the fog. She reached into her bag and pulled out a fresh ball of wool, her needles beginning their steady, comforting clicking. There were socks to be finished for her nephew, and a world of small domestic certainties to return to. In a world of grand tragedies and desperate acts, Jane Marple knew that the only true defence was to keep one's own stitches neat and one's own soul clear of the thorns. The train gathered speed, carrying her away from the shadows of the roses and back to the sunlight of the everyday,